Hi, I'm Mark Regev, and I'm here with my co-host Ruthie Blum for another episode of Israel Undiplomatic. How are you today, Ruthie?
I'm pretty good. I'd like to remind our viewers to please like and subscribe so that you can get notifications when our next episode appears. Now, Mark, I want to get right down to it. It's almost funny how the events in the news are happening so fast that we can't keep up with them. So I would like to, of course, talk about Syria. Just a few days ago, the Bashar Assad regime fell, and Assad is now apparently in Moscow. He and his family absconded to Moscow, and Syria has now been taken over by a bunch of rebel groups headed by an organization called the HTS and its leader, al-Julani. Now, I'd like to talk about what problems and opportunities that has presented for Israel, and also how that happened right under everybody's nose.
So I would say the following. In all politics, and maybe in all of life, if I can be philosophical for a moment, if you'll allow me, there's what you call the rule of unintended consequences, right? You know, there's all this stuff like they said, Johnson's Great Society in the 1960s maybe solved a bunch of problems, but then created a bunch of other problems, right? There's always the law of unintended consequences. And when Israel went into Lebanon to take care of Hezbollah, we were doing it for our own reasons. We were doing it because Hezbollah was a brutal and vicious enemy of Israel, and we had to push them back from the border, and we had to destroy, a large part of their military machine. They were a threat, and we had to help eliminate the threat. We did it for our own reasons, but the law of unintended consequences was this played out in a way where the Assad regime was dependent upon three anchors, so to speak. One anchor was Russia, and this we had nothing to do with whatsoever, but because of Russia's preoccupation with the Ukraine crisis, Russia's eyes weren't on the ball. Iran weakened because of this war and Israel's attacks on Iran, especially on destroying their air defense system. And finally, Hezbollah. During the Syrian civil war, Assad would have fallen without Hezbollah fighters on the ground, propping up his regime, Hezbollah fighters from Lebanon, propping up his regime, keeping him in power. And the minute Assad's opponents, who he had never destroyed, but he sort of kept them in these enclaves, where there was this standoff. The minute they saw that the foundations of his regime, Russia, Iran, and Hezbollah, were no longer there for him, they went on the offensive, and it was all over before you could say Jack Roberts.
Well, exactly. And speaking of unintended consequences, who would have imagined on October 7th, 2023, when Yahya Sinwar launched the worst atrocities against Jews since the Holocaust, and imagined that this was going to be the end of Israel? Who would have imagined that it was not only the end of him, his own end, but that 14 months later, we would have weakened Iran to the point that it's almost too easy at this point. I mean, if we don't attack its nuclear facilities, we'll be missing a great opportunity. But the main thing is, 14 months ago, Israel was in the huge trauma, rightly so. Also, we were very, very upset with our military and our political echelon and everything who missed this, and it was a huge surprise. But now a bigger surprise is that 14 months later, Hamas is almost completely demolished. Hezbollah is almost completely demolished. All Hezbollah leaders are dead. Hamas's main leaders are dead. Israel flew into Tehran and incapacitated its aerial defenses. And then the rebels took over. Assad fell. Now, the beauty of this is that finally, I think what we're seeing is that we're not going to buy into the lie that these rebels are now Democrats. They've come to save Syria. By we, I mean Israel, and in particular, Prime Minister Netanyahu. Thank God, because there have been times during his premiership over the years that I felt personally, even though I supported him, I felt that he wasn't tough enough on certain issues. Today, I see, for example, when we had our first pauses in fighting to have our first hostage releases, he said we would return to Gaza and fight, and we did. He said we'd go into Rafah, and we did. He said we'd go into Lebanon, and we did. And when he signed the ceasefire agreement, I got nervous, but no, that was November 27th, by the way, that it went into effect. And he kept his promise. Every single little violation by Hezbollah is met with the wrath of the IDF, thank God. And interestingly, it was on November 27th that the rebels started moving throughout Syria, taking over one city after another. These things are interconnected, and they do show us that the stronger we are, the better chance we have of victory and eventually peace. But not the bogus peace of the fantasists who are even now, there are people saying, oh, the people of Syria now, they're going to be free from... No, there is no people of Syria. Syria is a bunch of disparate tribes, ethnicities, religions, and the only jail they had, also there are Kurds, they're all Christians, Druze. The only jail they had was that they all hated the Assad regime, which is brutalized them, terrorized them. But they also hate Israel. So that...
I have to correct you a bit there, because it's not all the opposition that hates Israel. Important parts of the opposition, maybe the majority of the opposition. But let's get to this. Let's do what's good and what's bad about what happened in Syria. What's good about what's happened in Syria? And so, first thing, the chance that Hezbollah will violate the ceasefire in a serious way, right, has gone right down, because Hezbollah is now preoccupied, I think, in maintaining its position in Lebanon, because without Assad's buttress, right, without Assad's support, Hezbollah has a serious, serious problem in Lebanon. Second, Hezbollah has a problem rearming, because, of course, that route, Iran through Syria to arm Hezbollah, that's no longer there. And Hezbollah, I think, has a real problem, and it'll be interesting as to how the non-Hezbollah groups in Lebanon, the Christians, the Sunnis, the Druze, how they respond to the changes in Syria, because Hezbollah, because of, the Syrian domination of Lebanon, Hezbollah has had a special, a special status in Lebanon. Now, without that Syrian support, to what extent can there be a new, more healthy reality in Lebanon? So that's the first good thing. Hezbollah's ability to dominate Lebanon, and Hezbollah's ability to rearm and get new weapons, all that is very much changed since the changes in Syria. That's good for Israel. It's good for Lebanon. The other issue I think that's good for Israel is we've got to remember what the Iranian strategy was. And for many years, it appears that they were being successful. And their strategy was to encircle Israel. And the idea was we'd have these proxies in Lebanon, in Syria, in Yemen, in Gaza, like north, northeast, south, and immediate south around Israel. And as we know from reading the newspapers, there was all this intelligence about Iran focusing some sort of terrorist movement inside Jordan, which would not only threaten the regime, but allow Jordan to become a base for terrorist attacks on Israel in a huge way. And this strategy of encircling Israel, let's be frank, has fallen apart. Not only have the Iranians ceased building and expanding this encirclement of Israel, but we've rolled it back. In the time of the Cold War, there was containment versus rollback. So what Israel has succeeded in doing now, part of it intentionally, part of it as a result of other things that we've done, is we've rolled back. Lebanon is a different Lebanon today. And I think it can change in a positive direction. At least there's the potential. Syria without Assad, and there are bad things that could happen. We'll discuss them at a moment. But that Iran no longer has Syria as a satellite, no longer has Syria as a proxy. This is huge change in the region. And it will, and the whole idea, how can you encircle Israel if you no longer have these pawns on your chess field? So all these things are good for Israel. But now you want to discuss where the dangers are for Israel.
All right. Well, I would like to add one other arena that you forgot to mention, and that's Judea and Samaria, a.k.a. the West Bank, where also Iran has its footprint, and Jordan, through Jordan. Again, we have to watch our border with Jordan very carefully, because make no mistake, just because we have a treaty with Jordan, we also have a treaty with Egypt, and we saw that Egypt allowed Hamas to get armed and build tunnels. So we have to be wary of those kind of allies. But another good part about this whole thing is that Prime Minister Netanyahu has made it clear that he won't allow those rebels to endanger Israel. Now, how do we know he means it? Because in the last 2 days, a miraculous thing has happened. We have taken out so far 80% of the Syrian army and navy, its capabilities. It's air force, it's tanks, it's fleets, weapons, so that they don't. And Netanyahu made this clear: we're doing this. We're conducting these strikes so that these terrible weapons, and also we're searching for the chemical weapons, do not fall into the hands of bad actors. Now, most of those actors in Syria right now are bad actors. The leader of HTS was a member of Al-Qaeda. It was also there was a point at which it was connected with ISIS. Then it broke apart. He was against Al-Qaeda and ISIS, but he never de-radicalized. This was all infighting, jihadi infighting. Now, what he's done is he's pretending he got a haircut and he wears a suit and he goes on CNN or other channels. He's been being interviewed, claiming that actually, no, he wants to build a free Syria. Now, this really is so reminiscent of Yasser Arafat. When we gave him mouth-to-mouth resuscitation and brought him back from Tunisia, there was this sense that he's a reformer. He has abandoned his plan to kill all Jews. Of course, it was nonsense, and it is nonsense in this case. You're right. There are a tiny amount of people in Syria right now who are would-be allies, mainly part of the Kurds.
The Kurds and the Druze.
Some, again, not all of the Druze and not all of the Kurds. They, too, are split. But here's another very worrisome development. Who is behind this and bolstering now? You're right. Russia's gone. Iran's gone. This one's gone. Syria. Guess who's there? Turkey. Turkey is there, and Qatar. Two extremely bad actors. And we know that Erdogan has fantasies of creating a neo-Ottoman empire, and he wants to be the emperor, and he has his designs all over the place. And this, you're talking about he's a NATO ally, which is really ridiculous, but that's another issue. Qatar and Turkey, who are both now, which is also important, involved in negotiations to cause Hamas to release the hostages. So this has made things extremely complicated.
I, first of all, want to praise Israel for seizing the initiative. And, there are a lot of people who demonstrate, they're against the bomb, they're against proliferation. Well, what we've done in Syria over the last few days is probably the greatest act of deproliferation, non-proliferation, since Menachem Begin destroyed the Iraqi nuclear reactor and Ehud Olmert, to his credit, destroyed the Syrian nuclear reactor. Taking out and destroying any capabilities they have to build chemical or biological weapons, that's a major mitzvah. That's a good deed. And that we wouldn't want those sort of weapons to fall into the hands of bad actors. And as you said, there are some bad actors in Syria. And taking out their anti-aircraft systems, taking out their naval facilities, their naval potential, taking out their air force, taking out their armor corps. All those things is very important. very important, and I'm glad we've seized the opportunity. I did hear, and you will not be surprised to hear, that the UN Special Rapporteur or Special Representative for Syria, of course, condemned Israel and said Israel has to stop. And I would ask the following, why is Israel in Syria? So we've discussed now that Israel has very good reasons to defend itself, yes, against what could emerge. And I'd like you to notice that even Israel's critics have said, not all of them, but some of the more moderate critics, have said that actually it's very interesting. All these Israeli airstrikes have destroyed a lot of material, right? But very, very, very low casualties. In other words, we're obviously being as surgical as we can to take these targets out and avoid collateral damage. But he criticized Israel, and let's be clear, you spoke before, large parts of northern Syria are under Turkish control. There are 900, reportedly, I know only from the media, 900 American soldiers in Syria. There's a huge Russian naval presence and air force presence around Latakia in Syria. And for someone to say Israel should not be in there when we have direct interests, and you've got two world powers and one regional power there, and just to single out Israel, that for me, that's another sign of UN bias against Israel and a UN obsession. Now, why are we there? Right? Why are we there? Because we would be concerned that there are bad actors. Well, the United States itself targeted earlier this week ISIS in Syria, right? There's still ISIS in Syria as HTS. So one can be optimistic and one can be pessimistic. When I was the Israeli ambassador in London, so I met on occasion with Tony Blair, who was, a Labour prime minister. And people said when in his youth, when he was in Oxford, so he flirted with Trotskyism or the extreme left, the radical left. And so everyone's allowed to have a youthful indiscretion. I think that's them. And so can we look at this HTS movement and say, okay, this was this man's youthful indiscretion? I hope so, but we can't bank on it. And
no way.
And we have to build on the assumption that we don't want weapons in Syria going into the hands of bad actors, and therefore we are preempting. And as Netanyahu said, I'll quote Netanyahu and then I'll quote Biden. Netanyahu said that we want peace with Syria, we'd like to build a better reputation with Syria, but we're simply acting in our self-defense. We can't entertain the possibility that these sort of weapon systems could fall into the hands of ISIS-type extremists. The other thing that Biden said that I liked, and I think even you will like this, and you very seldom have a nice word to say about Biden. Biden said there's this new bunch of actors, he's been on CNN, I think yesterday he was on Sky. The new leader of Syria has sort of said, well, he's been saying all the right things. And Biden said, okay, but we will judge him by his actions. And I think there's a saying, the proof of the pudding is in the eating. Let's see what this guy does. We have some bad examples. When the dictatorship of Gaddafi in Libya fell apart, we saw what happened in Libya. The very opposite. A society that fell apart, and warlords and civil war and no democracy and no peace and love at all. We saw what happened when Saddam Hussein fell in Iraq. We saw what happened in Afghanistan after the Taliban. The Taliban also made, sort of moderate voices at the very beginning. So I hope for the sake of the Middle East, for Israel and for Syria, that the situation in Syria works itself out in a positive way. I'm just, it's the job for us to hope for the best, but to plan for the worst.
I just want to say that I would like to, tweak what you said about Netanyahu's statement. It was more interesting than that and more important than, we want peace with you. Now, I don't think he even used the word peace. He said, look, we're not after you, but make no mistake. If you're planning on doing anything, curtains for you. He didn't use those words.
He said, you'll end up like us.
You'll end up like us.
Correct.
I was hoping he'd say, you'll end up like Hania and like Nasrallah, okay, dead. But he didn't need to say that. He said, don't mess with us. And now, as for Biden, I'm sorry, I'm not giving him credit for saying that because, first of all, who knows Biden even knows what he's saying anymore. But to the extent that he does when he says, well, yes, we have to see, and they have to prove themselves. Biden is responsible for almost everything that is going on in the world, including October 7th. He has weakened the entire Western world, number one. Number two, when Syria, Biden being a clone of the Obama administration, when there were violations, when Assad was, gassing his own people, and Obama said there are red lines, he didn't give a crap about those red lines, and Biden doesn't either. And Biden abandoned Afghanistan to the Taliban. So you know what? I really don't care what lip service he pays. That is of no interest, and thank goodness in a month he'll be gone. And that brings us, by the way, to January 20th, when that's another important factor here, because everybody, especially Iran, everybody's shaking over the incoming Trump administration. Now, another thing you said was, well, the UN condemned Israel for being in Syria, and you said it's another example of UN's anti-Israel bias. It's an example of its anti-Semitism. And this, I would like to say, is a segue. Perfect.
Before we go to your perfect, I know where you want to go because we discussed it before the show.
Yes.
I want to say something more that needs to be said, I think, about Syria. And to talk about how this affects Iran. Because Iran had a very close relationship with the Hamas leadership, and the leaders of Hamas are no longer there. We have killed them. Iran had a very close relationship with the leadership of Hezbollah, and that's no longer there. Iran had a relationship with the leadership in Syria with President Assad. There are all these pictures of him and Khamenei hugging and kissing and so forth. Assad is no longer there in power. To what extent is what happened in Syria with the fall of this brutal, I said twice, dictator, who ended 50 years of this Ba'athist regime that was first his father and then his son, which is something amazing in political science. When a regime has no legitimacy, a Republican regime, it becomes monarchical and it goes from father to son and crazy. But to what extent is this going to inspire the people of Iran once again to think about their own regime? Once again, there's the picture of Khamenei with Ismail Haniyeh, who is no longer. There's the picture of Khamenei with Nasrallah, no longer. Picture of Khamenei with Assad, no longer running his country.
They're all dead. And
no, Assad's not dead. But
no.
Dead politically.
And yet dead politically.
Yeah. To what extent does that affect the way they look at their government?
Totally affects it. And I'll tell you, there's another huge difference. Because the times that the Iranian people have risen up and America abandoned them, thank you very much, Democrats, thank you, Obama, thank you, Biden. I have no doubt that the Iranian people are waiting for Trump's arrival with bated breath, because the one thing he would not do is say, no, that's you had a legitimate election and all this, and allow the regime to gun down everybody in the streets of Tehran. There are signs in Iran that they're ready to rise up, and rightly so, because they see that the regime that everyone was so terrified of, Israel too. Oh, we can't do that because we'll endanger ourselves. We saw that it was a total paper tiger. In one evening, we flew over there and we blitzed their air defenses. It turns out it wasn't as scary as everybody had thought. But yes, the nuclear weapons are scary. And one thing I'd like to say before we go on to our next topic, and that is that the late Bernard Lewis, the great Middle East scholar, said many, many years ago, when people said that there's, mutually assured destruction, like the Soviet Union and America both had nuclear weapons, and so it sort of prevented nuclear war. It prevented nuclear war. Yeah. He said you can't look at Iran that way, because whereas the Soviets were rational actors, they may have been evil, but they were rational. The jihadis and the Iranians did not have that same kind of rationality, because they have religious ideology that goes beyond international relations. And so, yes, we have to be afraid of them, because it's this idea that, okay, if they're on their last legs, they might as well get the nukes going and fire them. So this is the time that we have got to attack. We've got to attack their facilities. And at least when Trump enters office, one thing he won't do is tie our hands the way Biden did. So there is an opportunity here.
Could I say here, there's also the Iranians know that Syria had these Russian-built air defense systems and radar systems. And they are no longer. And somehow the route for the Israelis to Israeli Air Force to reach targets in Iran has somehow been opened up a lot.
Totally.
And so I'm sure they know that in Iran. And I think they hopefully understand that they would be playing literally with fire if they were to do something irresponsible with their nuclear program. As to whether Israel will preempt, I think that'll depend a lot on what happens in Washington, I agree.
And between Jerusalem and Washington, and I have no doubt there are talks going on behind the scenes about that, but I'm just saying, when you say they'd better not do it, as a matter of fact, what we have to be worried about is precisely their understanding that the only thing they have left, by the way, another thing that Trump is doing, he's going to enable America's oil reserves to be taken out of the ground. He's going to do it in such a way that we won't be reliant on that. Iran is losing all of its leverage of any kind, and it will lose all its money. All it's got is its nukes, and that's why you have to be afraid of them, because people who are desperate or in their last, and they might as well do one last hurrah. That's why I think we have to preempt. But I would like to go on to the next topic about anti-Semitism, because actually global anti-Semitism right now, it's not just global jihad. It's global anti-Semitism has really exploded since October 7th. Global jihad was always there. Anti-Semites were always there. But this is an explosion of the elites all over campuses, all over the West. And then the question is how it is responded to. Now, I want to talk about your country of birth, Australia, because this week really has shown, is a great example of how a country very liberal and a country, a melting pot of cultures and everything, suddenly, where there didn't used to be anti-Semitism, it's flourishing, and the government has enabled it. And this week, or a few days ago, a main synagogue in Melbourne was firebombed, and the response of the Australian government, the Prime Minister Albanese, has been hypocritical at best. So
you have seen the rise of anti-Semitism across the West and in Australia too. Now, I left Australia in 1982. I don't claim to be an expert. I've got friends and family there who know much more than me about what's it like to be Jewish in Australia today. But there was the firebombing of the synagogue in Melbourne, and it's clear from the news reports that I've seen and read that it must have been clear to the people who were firebombing that there were people inside the synagogue. In other words, they were trying to kill people. And this didn't come in a vacuum. It came in a period where the Jewish community in Australia is feeling increasingly embattled and increasingly living in a hostile environment. Then this morning on the way to the podcast, I heard that in Sydney, Australia's other big city, that there was another anti-Semitic, anti-Israel graffiti on houses in homes in a suburb with a large proportion of Jewish people. And this is after there was a firebombing or arson against a car with also anti-Israel. So I think Australian Jews are going through probably a difficult time. When I grew up there as a child, I don't remember feeling that sort of thing at all. It's come back to haunt. And this is a country that you said has prided itself on multiculturalism and diversity and live and let live, and there's a problem there. And, the government of Australia would defend itself by saying, look, we've been critical of Israel, but that's got nothing to do with Jews. And here I would say to them, that it's, you can't separate the two. When I was in London, there was, I think it was in 2017, there was a survey done by JPR, the Jewish Policy Research. It's a statistical group that does surveys. And, they do many practical things like how many Jewish children are being born today so we can have tomorrow, we'll have enough Jewish kindergartens. And, they do. But they also did a survey on anti-Semitism when I was there. And if you ask people in Britain, are they anti-Semitic? You'll get mostly a negative answer. Of course, I'm not anti-Semitic. But you ask other questions. You ask, like, do Jews have too much power in the media? Do Jews have a loyalty to another country? Do Jews have too much money? And things like this, yeah. And then you get the real answers, because if they answer, right? And they discovered a correlationship between anti-Israel and extreme anti-Israel opinion with anti-Semitism. To say it's got nothing to do with it, it's just you're anti-Israel, but you can love Jews. It's a myth. It doesn't happen.
Mark, to say that you need a survey to tell you that anti-Zionism is anti-Semitism, I think it's like all those other surveys. It's like, did you know if the temperature goes down outside, you need to wear a jacket? That's an important survey. Let me tell you something. We know that it's anti-Semitism. That's not criticism of Israel. Give me a break about criticism. That's the euphemism for let me bash Israel. And again, Australia, why do we see it? Why do we see it in America? Why do we see it in Australia? Left-wing governments. Your prime minister and your foreign minister in particular, not yours, no, yes. Australia's foreign minister. She is a hateful, hostile. She blames Israel for everything that's going on in Gaza. This is a government that said it has to respect the International Criminal Court's decision to issue arrest warrants against Netanyahu and former Defense Minister Gallant. They support UN resolutions, anti-Israel UN resolutions. In a climate like that, when you have protests saying Israel's committing genocide in Gaza, and the police in Australia say, oh, that's fine, it's legal, and the government does nothing. That is a mixture, and that's the same thing in America. Exactly. It's like, no, that's not, they're allowed to scream from the river to the sea, Palestine must be free. Nonsense. This is what happens when you have left-wing governments in Western countries. They side with the bad actors. It's appalling. It's outrageous. As you said, those are the parties. The left are the ones who protect gay rights, women's rights. They believe in the environment and this and that and everybody. And in Australia, indigenous population, they're bleeding hearts for everybody except Jews. And to accuse Israel of committing any kind of war crimes in Gaza is anti-Semitic. There's no middle ground here, Mark.
So I have siblings in Australia, 3 siblings, and they would probably agree with part of your criticism of the way the Australian government's been behaving, but they definitely wouldn't agree with it at all. And
so they probably voted for it. Just like my family, not my immediate family, I have many family members who voted Democrat and always have. No. That Jews wouldn't agree with what I'm saying? Oh, yeah, that's a big surprise. I know it. So what? So it doesn't make what I said wrong.
The current Australian government, the tragedy is, if you forget what's happened in the last few weeks in Australia, which is difficult to forget, but Australia traditionally has had a very positive attitude. And Israelis have had a very positive attitude about Australia.
Same about America, though. That's why I said it's similar.
And it's very sad. I mean, the Australian Prime Minister justified their atrocious UN vote by saying, well, another 100 and something countries voted for it as well. And I would say to them, well, okay, so Australia is now going to be one of these, one of these small critical European countries and anti-Israel, right? And so that's your defense. I don't know how this is going to play out in Australia, but here in the region, with what's happened in Syria, with what's happened in Lebanon, we're definitely on a positive dynamic. And on that happy note, I look forward to seeing you again next week.
I look forward to seeing you, as always, again as well.